In the heart of the 19th century, when industrial smoke rose above London's rooftops and the steady hum of progress filled the air, the British people turned to something they believed could preserve the soul of their rapidly changing world: refinement. The Victorian Era, named for Queen Victoria herself, was an age of elegance layered over anxiety, a time when the pursuit of gentility became a national obsession. The rigid structures of class began to blur as new wealth emerged from factories and commerce. But old families guarded their prestige through impeccable manners and controlled conduct. To be refined in Victorian England was to be more than polite. It was to live by a strict code that defined one's moral character, education, and worthiness to belong in polite society. Refinement demanded restraint in every aspect of life, from posture to pronunciation, from dinner table conversation to emotional expression. The self was to be mastered, not revealed. Men were taught to speak modestly, to avoid loud gestures, and to dress with discreet elegance. Women, meanwhile, were expected to embody grace and moral virtue, their silence often considered more admirable than their speech. This emphasis on behavior was not merely personal, it was deeply social and political. The British middle class, newly empowered by industry, looked to refinement as a way to prove themselves equal to the aristocracy, mimicking their customs while insisting on a moral superiority rooted in respectability. The home became a miniature kingdom of order, where every teacup, curtain, and polished brass knob testified to one's discipline. The Victorians wrote entire books about manners, with authors such as Mrs. Beeton transforming daily life into an instruction manual for virtue. These guides told people how to enter a room, how to offer condolences, how to hold their tongues, and how to conceal their true emotions behind the armor of composure. Beneath this rigid surface, however, was a current of insecurity. Refinement was not a natural state. It had to be learned, rehearsed, and performed endlessly, for one misstep could unravel an entire social reputation. And so, the drawing rooms of London and the parlors of country houses became stages where men and women performed civility under the unblinking gaze of peers. It was, paradoxically, both beautiful and suffocating, the art of living gracefully while hiding the strain of constant self-surveillance. The result was a culture of elegance, tinged with repression, where decorum mattered more than truth, and the smallest gestures carried moral weight. In the Victorian imagination, refinement was what separated humanity from savagery, civilization from chaos, and the respectable from the forgotten. It was both shield and prison, a dance of manners that gave the illusion of peace in a world forever changing. Among the countless rituals that governed Victorian society, few were as revealing or as carefully orchestrated as the simple act of greeting. In an age obsessed with hierarchy, propriety, and appearances, a greeting was never merely a gesture of acknowledgement. It was a declaration of one's class, breeding, and moral worth. Every bow, every nod, every exchange of glances was part of a larger social choreography, one that could elevate or destroy a person's standing with astonishing speed. For a gentleman, the bow was his badge of civility. It had to be neither too deep nor too shallow, for either extreme betrayed a lack of refinement. A shallow bow suggested arrogance, while an overly deep one reeked of servility. Women were taught the art of the curtsy, their skirts carefully lifted just enough to avoid impropriety, their heads tilted with modest grace. Even the eyes played a role. Meeting a superior's gaze too boldly was insolent, but avoiding it entirely suggested awkwardness or guilt. When men greeted women, the situation became even more delicate. A gentleman would never initiate a handshake with a lady unless she offered her hand first. Even then, he must do so gently, with his glove on, and for no more than a brief moment. To linger was indecent. To squeeze was unforgivable. The tone of one's voice also mattered. A greeting had to be soft, measured, and sincere, without crossing into familiarity. In large gatherings or social events, formal introductions were essential. One could not speak to a stranger without being properly presented by the host. This ritual of introduction reinforced the rigid social hierarchy person's worth and proximity to. Respectability were established before a single word was exchanged. Calling cards extended this system into daily life. If one wished to visit a friend or announce one's arrival in town, a small engraved card bearing one's name was left at the door, often by a servant. These cards carried hidden meanings. A folded corner indicated a personal visit. A turned-down edge expressed condolences, and a simple, unmarked card conveyed polite neutrality. Silence, too, spoke volumes. A card not returned was a subtle form of social rejection. Even street greetings followed elaborate codes. When walking in Hyde Park or along London's polished boulevards, a man was to tip his hat only to women of proper acquaintance. To bow to a stranger or a lower-class woman would mark him as unrefined. Women, meanwhile, were expected to acknowledge greetings with gentle restraint. The distance between two people determined how they might greet. Close friends might nod warmly. Acquaintances exchanged formal bows, and superiors were always given the first move. What to modern eyes seems trivial was, to the Victorians, a moral discipline. To greet correctly was to demonstrate control over one's impulses, to respect order and custom, to maintain the delicate balance between intimacy and decorum. It was a world where even a smile had social weight, where too much warmth could be scandalous, and too little might be rude. Every motion was a signal, every word a thread in the invisible web of Victorian civility. And though the entire system might seem suffocatingly dull to those who lived within it, greeting etiquette was a language of its own, a quiet ballet of bows, nods, and polite murmurs that transformed the ordinary act of acknowledgement into an elegant, almost sacred ritual. If greetings were the opening act of Victorian civility, conversation was its grand performance, a delicate dance of words, wit, and restraint that revealed not only one's intellect. To speak in the Victorian era was to expose one's breeding, one's education, and one's respect for propriety, for every syllable carried the weight of social expectation. Conversation, like everything else in that age, was governed by rules so intricate and precise that even spontaneity had to appear rehearsed. The Victorians believed that speech was not a tool for expression, but an instrument of control. One's words must never betray emotion, impulse, or vulgar familiarity. Men and women alike were trained from youth to measure their tone, to soften their laughter, and to suppress opinions that might offend. Men led discussions, but even their leadership was to be tempered with humility. One must never lecture, boast, or appear too clever, lest he seem arrogant or insufferable. Women, on the other hand, were expected to listen attentively, respond with grace, and contribute observations that were intelligent but never assertive. In this careful choreography, silence was often more powerful than speech. To remain quiet at the right moment showed judgment and control, while to speak too eagerly suggested a lack of refinement. The subjects deemed appropriate for polite conversation were remarkably limited. Whether art, music, literature, and light travel anecdotes were acceptable, politics, religion, money, and personal matters were strictly forbidden. Even humor had to be gentle, never coarse or exaggerated. A well-bred man might tell a mild witticism that provoked smiles, but never laughter loud enough to draw attention. The very sound of laughter could define a person's class. A restrained chuckle was genteel. A hearty guffaw was common. At dinner parties, conversations were carefully balanced, ensuring no one person dominated the table. To interrupt was unthinkable. To contradict was worse. Disagreement, when necessary, was softened by verbal cushions phrases such as, "I beg to differ slightly," or perhaps another view might be considered a loud dissent without offense. Compliments were also an art. Too much enthusiasm appeared insincere, while too little was cold. Everything had to be perfectly measured, perfectly moderate, perfectly polite. Even the pacing of conversation mattered. Pauses must not be too long, which implied dullness, nor too short, which seemed impulsive. And always, beneath the surface of every exchange, there flowed an undercurrent of performance. The drawing room was a stage, and its players dressed in silk and manners, each performing civility for the approval of others. For the Victorians, conversation was not a means of connection, but a mirror reflecting moral order. It was a space where self-control replaced honesty, where charm masked boredom, and where the suppression of feeling was celebrated as a sign of strength. Yet there was artistry in Ita beauty, born of rhythm and precision, like a minuet danced with words. To master conversation was to ascend in society, to command respect, and to demonstrate one's worthiness to belong among the refined. In an era terrified of chaos and scandal, speech was civilization's finest defensive shield, woven from elegance, caution, and the endless practice of saying the right thing in exactly the right way. In a century that valued restraint above passion and composure above candor, the Victorians found in the written word a perfect medium for controlled expression. Letters and calling cards were not mere tools of communication. They were extensions of one's identity, tangible emblems of civility, and miniature portraits of the soul rendered in ink. The art of correspondence was sacred, a ritual performed with precision and poise. Every aspect of letter writing, from the texture of the paper to the flourish of one's signature, was governed by etiquette. The well-bred Victorians chose fine, stationary creamy paper, embossed with delicate monograms or family crest sand, used ink of impeccable consistency, avoiding smudges or blots that might suggest carelessness or haste. A letter was to be written in a graceful hand, its sentences flowing with measured elegance, devoid of slang, abbreviations, or any hint of vulgar familiarity. Emotion, though often present, was veiled behind courtesy and formality. A declaration of affection might be disguised as concern for health, a plea for forgiveness, cloaked in polite understatement. The tone had to balance warmth and decorum, sincerity, and self-restraint. Even the folding of the paper followed unspoken rules: never crumpled, never folded unevenly, and sealed with care, often with a wax seal bearing one's initials. For women, letter writing was both an art and an acceptable outlet for intellect and feeling. Many spent hours at their writing desks, crafting perfect lines to friends, family, or suitors under the watchful eyes of propriety. Parallel to letters were the calling cards, stiff and beautifully engraved rectangles of social identity. These cards were essential to Victorian life, acting as silent messengers of status and intention. A lady or gentleman never visited another without first sending or leaving a calling card, which was typically presented on a silver tray by a servant. The card bore only one's name and sometimes an address, for anything more would be considered ostentatious. Yet every detail, the font, the spacing, the thickness of the paper, spoke of one's refinement. The very act of delivering or returning a card carried symbolic meaning. A turned-down corner meant personal visit. A folded edge expressed congratulations or condolences. A card left unmarked might simply convey polite acknowledgement. Failure to return a card was a quiet yet devastating insult, signaling rejection or disapproval. Through these small gestures, entire relationships were maintained, nurtured, or severed without a word being spoken. The ritual of correspondence and card exchange turned human connection into ceremonial way of speaking through silence, of maintaining intimacy while preserving distance. To the Victorians, written words and printed names were not impersonal. They were moral acts. They demonstrated patience, discipline, and taste, the qualities most revered in a society terrified of disorder. Even mourning letters, edged in black, adhered to rigid conventions, as grief itself was expected to be dignified and neatly phrased. The post became an artery of civilization, carrying not only news but propriety, linking distant hearts through the language of etiquette. Today, it may seem suffocating that such beauty had to hide behind so many rules. But to the Victorians, the formality was the beauty. A letter unsent was a feeling unshared. A card not returned was a world quietly closing its doors. In the stillness of ink and paper, they found a way to express emotion without breaking decorum, to feel deeply while appearing calm, to love without losing control. Thus, every letter and every calling card became a performance of virtue, a whisper of character in a world where appearances were everything and silence, when done gracefully, was the highest form of speech. Of all the intricate customs that defined Victorian society, none embodied its spirit of surveillance and propriety more completely than the practice of chaperonage. In an age obsessed with appearances and moral purity, the figure of the chaperone stood as both guardian and gatekeeper, ensuring that no young woman's reputation ever strayed into dangerous territory. To be a respectable lady in the 19th century was to live under the constant supervision of watchful eyes of mothers, aunts, widowed relatives, or older friends appointed to serve as moral sentinels. The role of the chaperone was not simply to accompany, but to control. Her presence was a shield against gossip, temptation, and impropriety. No unmarried woman of standing could be seen walking alone in public, riding in a carriage unaccompanied, or attending a social event without her chaperone by her side. A stroll through Hyde Park might appear leisurely, but every step was monitored, every glance carefully noted. The chaperone's very presence declared to society that virtue was intact and vigilance unbroken. For the Victorians, reputation was as delicate as glass, and a single crack could shatter an entire family's standing. Thus, even the most innocent meeting between a man and a woman required formal oversight. Balls and dinner parties were the arenas where the chaperone's power was most visible. She was stationed strategically, often near the refreshments or beside the musicians, where she could observe without appearing intrusive. Her approval determined whether a young lady might dance with a suitor, and for how many sets. To dance more than twice with the same man was scandalous. To converse in a secluded corner without a witness was unthinkable. A chaperone might pretend to be engaged in polite conversation herself, yet her attention was always alert to every whisper, every glance. Beyond her immediate duties, the chaperone served a symbolic function in the grand theater of Victorian decorum. She was society's conscience made flesh, the embodiment of restraint and moral discipline. But beneath the surface of her authority, there was irony. The more society insisted on supervision, the more creativity young people developed to escape it. Lovers found ways to exchange letters hidden in hymn books, to whisper through the rustle of fans, or to meet briefly under the pretext of returning a borrowed novel. The chaperone's vigilance could delay romance, but it rarely prevented it. Still, the system endured because it preserved appearances, and in the Victorian world, appearance was reality. The chaperone's influence extended beyond the ballroom into the moral imagination of the time. Novels and plays of the era often portrayed her as a comical relic of conservatism, stern, overprotective, sometimes meddlesome. But even these portrayals acknowledged her power. She was a symbol of the society's deepest fear, that without rules, the fragile balance of virtue and vice might collapse. By the late Victorian period, as women began to demand education, employment, and a measure of independence, the chaperone slowly faded into obsolescence. Yet, her ghost lingered in the collective psyche, shaping how propriety and femininity continued to be judged long after her physical absence. In truth, she was less a person than a system, an invisible contract that bound women to the expectations of others. To live under her gaze was to live within the boundaries of respectability. To rebel against her was to risk exile from polite society. And so, for decades, she remained a fixture of every respectable household. Her steady eyes, a reminder that virtue in the Victorian world was not merely a private quality, but a public performance constantly rehearsed. In the grand theater of Victorian life, where every gesture, word, and glance was weighed against the scales of propriety, clothing became far more than a matter of taste. The Victorians believed that how one dressed revealed not only social rank, but inner virtue, as if the soul itself could be read in the cut of a coat or the modest drape of a gown. Respectability demanded visible evidence, and fashion served as its armor. To appear slovenly or flamboyant was not merely poor manners, it was moral failure. For men, a well-fitted suit of dark wool, tailored with exacting precision, spoke of discipline, industriousness, and seriousness of character. His cravat, neatly tied and immaculately clean, became a sign of personal control, while his polished boots reflected not vanity, but integrity. Every button, every crease communicated an unspoken creed. The respectable man must be orderly, self-composed and modest. Women bore an even heavier burden, for their garments were meant to manifest purity itself. Layers of petticoats, corsets, and high-necked blouses acted as both protection and proclamation, protection from the male gaze, and proclamation of chastity and self-restraint. The body was to be hidden, its contours softened beneath fabric, its presence whispered rather than shown. Even color carried moral weight. Pale shades suggested innocence, while deeper hues implied maturity or daring. Yet, beneath this facade of virtue, fashion was a battlefield where class and hypocrisy intertwined. The working classes, unable to afford fine materials, were condemned as morally suspect, their simplicity mistaken for sloth. The middle class, desperate for legitimacy, clung to the rules of propriety with fervor, ensuring that every hemline and hat ribbon conformed to the dictates of respectability. The upper classes, meanwhile, flaunted opulence under the guise of refinement. Silks, velvets, and lace used not merely to adorn the body, but to assert dominance. Ironically, what society praised as modesty often enslaved women in garments that restricted movement, distorted posture, and dictated behavior. The corset, hailed as a symbol of grace and discipline, became a cage of whalebone and steel that reshaped both body and spirit. To endure its constriction without complaint was itself considered virtuous. Pain, after all, was the price of purity. Even children were drawn into this moral costume. Drama boys dressed as miniature gentlemen, girls as tiny models of decorum. Clothing, then, became an early lesson in control, teaching the young that identity must always be constructed, never simply lived. Fashion magazines of the day, such as the Queen and Godey's Ladies' Book, transformed moral instruction into glossy aspiration. They dictated not only what to wear, but how to behave, embedding ethical codes within patterns and cuts. A woman's bonnet might be described as chaste, a gown as becoming of quiet virtue. Thus, morality became commercialized, stitched, and sold across Britain's empire. But the true brilliance of Victorian fashion lay in its contradictions. It both concealed and revealed, restricted and empowered. To dress properly was to belong. To err was to risk exclusion from polite society. Every morning, as the Victorians dressed, they performed their identities, uncorseting their desires, polishing their ambitions, buttoning up their weaknesses. Clothing was not mere fabric, but moral theater, and to the ever-watchful Victorian eye, the line between decency and disgrace could be measured in inches of lace or the shine of a shoe. In that world, appearance was not vanity, was virtue materialized, the visible manifestation of a soul determined to appear good, even if it suffered to do so. In the rigidly codified world of the Victorians, where even the smallest gestures carried moral weight, accessories were far more than decorative ornaments. They were a subtle, silent language through which character, status, and emotion were expressed. Every glove, hat, fan, and brooch was a symbol. Every accessory, a statement carefully chosen to align with the complex vocabulary of respectability. To the untrained eye, a lady's gloves might appear a simple article of fashion, but in truth, they were the very armor of her virtue. Gloves protected not only the hands, but the reputation. Bare skin suggested intimacy, and the slightest exposure could scandalize a drawing room. The color of a glove mattered to white for innocence and purity, gray for mourning or humility, and darker hues for maturity or discretion. Men, likewise, used gloves to express restraint and refinement, removing them only in private settings or during greetings of solemn formality. The act of removing one's glove before shaking hands was itself a ritual of respect, an acknowledgement that decorum was as much physical as moral. The fan, meanwhile, was the most eloquent of all accessories, a secret language, fluttering in the hands of women who otherwise had little freedom of speech. The language of the fan became a courtly code. A fan opened slowly meant curiosity. A fan dropped to the floor declared friendship, and fanning rapidly suggested displeasure. Beneath the silent sweep of satin and lace, women found a means to express what words could not desire, annoyance or amusement, all within the limits of propriety. Jewelry, too, spoke volumes, though its meanings were layered with class and sentiment. Pearls symbolized purity, cameos conveyed refinement, and lockets often concealed portraits or strands of hair from absent loved ones. Engagement rings and mourning brooches were emotional talismans that turned personal feeling into public statement, yet always within the boundaries of decorum. Even men, though less adorned, displayed their character through restrained elegance. A pocket watch on a silver chain hinted at punctuality and discipline, while a signet ring engraved with a family crest proclaimed lineage and honor. For both sexes, the cane or parasol was not merely a practical object, but a badge of identity, a prop that turned everyday life into a performance of taste. The tilt of a hat or the knot of a cravat, nothing was accidental. Every item served a symbolic function within the great moral narrative of appearance. What made accessories uniquely Victorian was their ability to transform social silence into visual eloquence. In a society where speech was censored by etiquette and emotion suppressed by custom, adornment became communication. A woman might never speak openly of love, but her brooch, placed slightly off-center, might whisper it for her. A widow's black veil declared her grief to the world, while protecting her modesty behind a curtain of lace. The moral and emotional life of an entire class was thus written not in words, but in fabric, metal, and gesture. And yet, this very language of beauty was also a chain binding people to their stations. A misplaced accessory could expose an impostor. A poor imitation might invite ridicule or ruin. For the Victorians, there was no such thing as mere decoration. Every object on the body was a statement of intent. Every adornment a reflection of the soul's discipline. To live among such symbols was to exist within an endless conversation between self and society. Dialogue spoken not with words, but with ribbons, jewels, and lace, where silence itself, shimmered with meaning and virtue, could be measured by the sheen of satin. In the ornamental world of the Victorians, where every inch of appearance served as a moral proclamation, hairstyles and hats became intricate emblems of identity, revealing one's class, age, and virtue at a single glance. The arrangement of hair and the tilt of a hat were not mere matters of personal tastes. They were coded signals in a society obsessed with appearances and reputation. For women, the head was considered the crown of modesty, and the way it was adorned could either elevate her to the status of a lady or reduce her to scandal. Hair was to be carefully controlled, pinned and arranged in elaborate yet disciplined styles that spoke of refinement and patience. Loose hair was dangerous, hinted at sensuality and rebellion. Only young, unmarried girls could wear their hair down, and even then, only in private or informal settings. Married women, by contrast, wore their hair tightly coiled in buns or braids, often adorned with ribbons, combs, or flowers that matched their gowns. These intricate coiffures were not simply aesthetic. They symbolized moral order and domestic virtue, a visible manifestation of a woman's self-restraint and composure. Hats, meanwhile, were the crowning symbols of status across every class. For women, bonnets reigned supreme in the early Victorian decade's delicate constructions of silk, lace, and ribbon that framed the face modestly, shielding it from both the sun and the gaze of strangers. A bonnet that revealed too much of the face risked scandal. One too large suggested pretension. By the later Victorian years, as industry and urban life transformed society, bonnets gave way to wider-brimmed hats decorated with feathers, flowers, and sometimes even taxidermied birds. These were not merely fashion statements. They were declarations of taste, wealth, and moral confidence. The higher the plume, the more daring the spirit, though always tempered by restraint, for excess flirted with vulgarity. For men, the hat was his calling card in the theater of the street. The top hat became the universal symbol of respectability, gleaming cylinder of authority, worn by bankers, politicians, and gentlemen of ambition. Its height and shine reflected not only one's class, but one's moral stature. A man's hat etiquette was so strictly observed that failing to remove it before a lady or in a church could destroy his social reputation. The working classes, meanwhile, wore flat caps or bowlers, their practicality betraying both occupation and origin. Thus, in the hierarchy of headwear, one could read the invisible map of Victorian society, from the aristocrat's towering silk hat to the laborer's soot-darkened cap, hairstyles, and hats. Though trivial by modern standards, were moral instruments in an age that equated outer discipline with inner virtue. To tend one's hair daily was not vanity but duty, a ritual of self-command. Women spent hours before mirrors, aided by maids, arranging curls and plaits into perfect symmetry, for symmetry itself was seen as an expression of moral balance. The wealthy adorned their hair with pearls and jeweled combs, while middle-class women imitated these trends with modest substitutes of glass or ribbon. Men's grooming was equally ritualistic: hair neatly parted, beards and mustaches trimmed to reflect gravitas without extravagance. The beard, once controversial, became by mid-century a symbol of manly virtue and respectability, inspired by ideals of natural strength and patriarchal dignity. Thus, the head, whether covered or uncovered, became a theater of moral performance. Every curl, every feather, every tilt of a brim carried meaning, signaling one's place in the moral and social order. To step into the streets of Victorian London was to enter a sea of coded appearances, where the wind might ruffle not only one's hat but one's reputation. In such a world, to dress one's head was to declare one's soul. For the Victorians believed deeply that virtue, like fashion, must always be worn in plain sight. To live in the Victorian era was to live under an unending pageant of rules, and none were more visible or more fiercely obeyed than those dictating what one should wear, when, and why. dress was never merely a matter of personal choice. It was a moral, social, and even spiritual obligation. Every time a gentleman tied his cravat or a lady fastened her corset, they were not simply preparing for the day, they were declaring their respect for the invisible order that governed society. The Victorians believed that propriety began with appearance, and thus strict dress codes divided every hour, event, and class. Mourning attire, for example, was intentionally simple and modest. Men wore dark coats and crisp collars, while women favored light muslin gowns in muted tones, reflecting the purity and diligence appropriate to early hours. Afternoon dress, however, allowed a degree of ornamentation, richer fabrics, subtle jewelry, and delicate gloves suitable for calling hours and social visits. By evening, fashion reached its ceremonial climax. Men donned formal black tailcoats and gleaming white waistcoats, symbols of self-discipline and control, while women transformed into visions of elegance. Their gowns low-necked yet modestly adorned, their gloves reaching nearly to the shoulder. Even these rare hints of sensuality were carefully codified, reminding all that beauty was acceptable only when framed by virtue. Every occasion had its uniform, and deviation was a form of social rebellion. A lady who appeared at an afternoon tea in a gown too elaborate risked being labeled pretentious, while one who arrived at a ball in understated attire might be pitied, or worse, dismissed as provincial. Men, too, were bound by unspoken laws. A mourning hat worn after dusk or a colored waistcoat at a solemn event could mark him as uncultivated. The elaborate network of rules surrounding dress created a world in which conformity was both safety and virtue. Fashion manuals, such as Beaton's Book of Household Management, provided guidance so exacting it bordered on sacred text, instructing readers on when to wear black crepe for mourning, how long a veil should be worn after a death, and which fabrics were permissible for each season. The upper classes adhered to these standards with the confidence of authority, while the middle classes followed them with anxious devotion, hoping that correct attire might elevate their social position. Clothing thus became a moral compass, guiding individuals through the treacherous terrain of reputation. For women especially, dress codes were intertwined with the concept of moral visibility. The purity of the home was mirrored in the cleanliness of the gown, the order of the soul in the neatness of the hem. Even accessories were timed: gloves for the afternoon, fans for the evening, parasols for the promenade. Mourning attire was an entire language in itself, deep black for immediate grief, then gradually fading to gray and lavender as sorrow was expected to soften over time. To defy these codes was to defy decorum itself, a dangerous act in a society where virtue was performed as spectacle. Yet, within these restrictions lay the paradox of Victorian identity. Obedience brought safety, but it also demanded suppression. Every rule was a boundary, and every boundary defined not only class but identity. To the Victorians, the etiquette of dress was the etiquette of existence. Through fabric and fashion, they transformed the chaos of human nature into order, ensuring that even the passions of the heart were clothed in the discipline of silk and lace. Thus, to be well-dressed was not simply to be admired. It was to be moral, to be seen, and above all, to belong. In the grand architecture of Victorian society, presentation was not simply a matter of vanity, was the scaffolding upon which one's entire identity rested. To present oneself correctly was to command respect. To misstep was to invite ruin. Every man, woman, and child lived beneath the gaze of a world that judged appearance as a mirror of the soul. The Victorians believed that virtue must be visible, and thus presentation became both moral performance and social survival. From the polished boots of a gentleman to the neatly tied ribbons of a lady's bonnet, each detail contributed to a portrait of self-control, discipline, and respectability. Even posture was a moral act. Slouching implied laziness, while an upright stance projected integrity. Facial expression, too, was bound by etiquette. A serene countenance suggested spiritual steadiness. Loud laughter or unrestrained gestures hinted at vulgarity. A lady's smile was to be soft and measured, inviting, but never bold. A man's gaze, direct but never lingering. In public spaces, on promenades, in carriages, or at social gatherings, presentation was everything. One dressed not merely to please, but to communicate belonging. The world was a stage, and to appear careless was to risk social exile. Presentation extended beyond personal appearance to encompass the entire environment of life. The home, for instance, reflected the moral standing of its inhabitants. Curtains, carpets, and furniture were curated to display modest refinement rather than excess. Visitors read one's virtue in the symmetry of the parlor and the cleanliness of the silverware. A well-kept house suggested industriousness and moral discipline. Disorder implied spiritual decay. Even the way one wrote a letter or arranged flowers could signify the depth of one's cultivation. The Victorians thus transformed everyday life into an art of appearance. This is a world where the external always symbolized the internal. For the rising middle classes, this obsession with presentation was both opportunity and burden. Respectability could be purchased, displayed, and performed, even if it could not always be felt. A man might struggle with debt or despair, but so long as his hat was polished and his manners composed, he remained a gentleman. Women, in turn, were expected to embody beauty tempered by modesty, charm restrained by silence. The successful presentation of self was, for them, a form of power, the only one society permitted. Beneath this obsession, however, lay the deep anxiety of a culture terrified of exposure. The power of presentation came not from authenticity, but from illusion, the ability to hide imperfection behind refinement. Etiquette manuals and conduct books flourished, teaching readers how to walk, sit, and even breathe correctly, as though virtue could be choreographed. In this world, truth mattered less than perception. A single misstep, a stain on a glove, a lapse in decorum could dismantle years of careful self-construction. Yet, within this rigid theater of manners, there was also artistry. Presentation was the great equalizer, allowing those of modest birth to climb the social ladder through impeccable behavior and taste. It transformed the body and home into canvases upon which morality was painted in gestures, fabrics, and words. In the end, the Victorians' devotion to presentation revealed both their fragility and their strength. They lived in a world that demanded masks, yet they turned those masks into masterpieces. To present oneself was not to deceive, but to declare, "I understand the code. I belong to civilization." And so, beneath layers of satin, starch, and self-control, the Victorians mastered the grand illusion that the surface was the soul, and that beauty, discipline, and grace could redeem even the most ordinary life. To be a gentleman in the Victorian era was not simply to be a man of wealth or status. It was to embody an entire moral philosophy, a living sermon in human form. The ideal Victorian gentleman was a creature of restraint, honor, and unwavering self-control, molded by the twin forces of industrial ambition and moral propriety. His world demanded dignity without arrogance, intelligence without ostentation, and courage without brutality. He was expected to lead without dominance, to serve without servility, and to move through life as if every gesture were a testament to divine order. The true gentleman did not shout or boast. He spoke in measured tones, with clarity and patience. His handshake was firm, but never forceful. His gaze confident, but never intrusive. Above all, he was a man of principle, defined not by his birth, but by his behavior. Courtesy was his religion, composure his creed. Even in moments of anger or temptation, he was to remain unshaken, for to lose control was to lose respectability in the drawing rooms and clubs of London. The gentleman was the moral compass of society. He dressed in sober colors, black, navy, or charcoal gray, to symbolize his integrity and industriousness. His attire was not for vanity, but for discipline. Even his neatly brushed hat and polished boots reflected his inner order. Work was his virtue, moderation his strength. He was punctual, reserved, and endlessly aware of his own reputation. His leisure pursuits, hunting, reading, or attending the theater, were to be conducted with quiet enjoyment, never excess. Gambling, drunkenness, or open displays of passion were the marks of the unrefined. To treat servants and women with kindness was not merely polite, it was proof of nobility. A gentleman's manners revealed the depth of his moral training. His respect for others, especially those of lower station, distinguished him from mere wealth or power. He was to protect the weak, guide the ignorant, and correct the rude, all without appearing superior. In conversation, he avoided gossip, profanity, and loud laughter. The true gentleman could disagree without offense, command without cruelty, and lose without complaint. But beneath this polished surface lay the tension of a world changing faster than its values. The Industrial Revolution had blurred the boundaries of class, creating self-made men who strove to imitate aristocratic elegance while redefining its meaning. The Victorian gentleman was thus both a symbol of stability and a product of anxiety. His manners were not innate, but learned a lifelong performance, requiring vigilance. The code he lived by demanded constant self-surveillance, for even the smallest lapse could destroy the illusion of moral superiority. Yet this same code also gave him purpose. It bound his restless ambitions to ideals of duty and honor, transforming the chaos of modern life into a pattern of civility. In public, he was a model of composure. In private, he might wrestle with doubt, desire, or disillusionment. Still, he endured, for endurance itself was virtue. To be a gentleman was to wear one's conscience like a perfectly tailored suit, visible, precise, and unwrinkled by passion. And though the centuries have since unstitched his world, the figure of the Victorian gentleman endures, a reminder of a time when decency was theater, discipline was elegance, and the truest mark of manhood was not strength, but self-mastery. If the Victorian gentleman was the pillar of morality, then the Victorian lady was its shining crown, the embodiment of grace, purity, and restraint, upon which the moral order of the empire depended. To be a lady in the 19th century was not a matter of wealth or beauty alone. She was expected to be calm in voice, soft in manner, modest in dress, and unshakable in virtue. Her existence revolved around the sacred ideals of domesticity and decorum. She was to be the quiet heart of the home, radiating moral light through her composure and tenderness. From the moment she rose in the morning to the time she retired, every act was ritualized by propriety. Her speech must never be loud, her laughter never unguarded, and her opinions always tempered by humility. Education was permitted, but only insofar as it enhanced her moral and conversational grace. A lady might read poetry or the Bible, but she must avoid subjects too intellectual or political, for to appear overly clever was to risk seeming unfeminine. Her most important art was that of silence, knowing what not to say, what not to show, and how to conceal deep feeling behind a veil of serenity. Her appearance, too, was an extension of her virtue. Every curl, every ribbon, every fold of her gown was chosen to reflect purity and refinement rather than vanity. Modesty was her armor, elegance her diplomacy. The Victorian lady's beauty lay in restraint, in the way she managed to captivate without revealing. Her hands were to be gloved, her posture upright, her eyes modestly lowered in public. The perfect lady was graceful even in stillness, her presence marked by composure rather than animation. To lose her temper or raise her voice was unthinkable. To show too much ambition, scandalous. Yet within these boundaries, she exercised a subtle but profound influence. In the drawing room, she was the silent ruler of taste and manners. In the home, the moral governor of her family. Her task was not merely to maintain order, but to embody it, to make goodness beautiful and beauty good. She tended to her children with gentle discipline, supported her husband's ambitions with quiet loyalty, and extended charity to the poor in ways that preserved both dignity and distance. Her piety was constant but understated, her faith an unspoken rhythm guiding her every gesture. But beneath this portrait of composure lay a life of intense confinement. The perfect Victorian lady was both idol and prisoner, her freedom exchanged for reverence. Society's admiration came at the cost of individuality. To step outside prescribed behavior was to risk ruin. Gossip was as lethal as sin. Many women chafed beneath these expectations, finding in music, painting, or secret correspondence their only outlets of self-expression. Yet even rebellion had to be discreet, wrapped in the same lace and silence that defined obedience. Contradiction of her existence, power through submission, influence through invisibility, made her both the most admired and the most misunderstood figure of her age. Still, the ideal endured because it reflected the values of an anxious society: order, purity, and the illusion of moral perfection. To be a Victorian lady was to live in a world that worshipped restraint, that feared passion, and that turned womanhood into an art of stillness. And though history has moved beyond her, the image of the perfect Victorian lady remains serene, graceful, and impossibly composed, a ghost of gentility haunting every mirror that reflects beauty bound by rules. In the moral theater of Victorian society, marriage was not merely a union of hearts, but the very cornerstone of civilization, a sacred institution through which duty, virtue, and social order were preserved. It was both contract and covenant, designed to maintain moral stability in a world trembling under the weight of industrial change. Love, though not forbidden, was often considered secondary to responsibility. Passion was to be tamed by principle, affection governed by decorum. The Victorian couple lived under a code of harmony that was less emotional than ethical. A husband's duty was to provide, protect, and represent authority. A wife's to nurture, obey, and uphold domestic purity. The home itself was seen as a moral sanctuary, a fortress against the chaos of the modern world. Within its walls, the man ruled with quiet firmness, and the woman reigned with gentle grace. She tended to the spiritual and emotional well-being of the household, ensuring that every object and action reflected respectability. Even the simplest routines, setting the table, reading scripture, or pouring tea were imbued with moral significance. Cleanliness was not only about hygiene, but about the purity of the soul. Order, not just comfort, but righteousness. For women, marriage represented both duty and destiny. From girlhood, they were taught that their highest achievement was to become a wife and mother, the guardian angel of the home. Conduct books and sermons instructed them that submission was strength and that the secret to happiness lay in obedience. A good wife was expected to manage her household with skill and serenity, to soothe her husband's temper, conceal his flaws, and never let the outside world glimpse discord. She was the moral compass, yet her influence had to remain invisible. The husband, in turn, bore the weight of financial and social responsibility. His public reputation was intertwined with his wife's virtue. Her modesty was his honor, her behavior his respectability. Marriage thus became a mutual performance of propriety, where each partner played a role defined by centuries of moral expectation. Even affection followed a script: gentle admiration, not passion; companionship, not equality. Love letters were composed in delicate language, affection veiled in restraint. To display too much emotion was vulgar, to display none, tragic. And yet, beneath this polished surface of duty and decorum, the private world of Victorian marriage was often fraught with loneliness and quiet rebellion. Many women, confined within domestic walls, longed for education, adventure, or simply acknowledgement beyond their household roles. Some sought solace in charitable work, others in secret writing or correspondence. Men, too, struggled beneath the weight of unrelenting expectation, the pressure to succeed, to provide, to remain unyielding even when hearts faltered. The home that was meant to be a haven sometimes became a stage for silent endurance. Still, the ideal persisted, sustained by the belief that domestic harmony was the foundation of moral society. Even Queen Victoria herself, devoted to Prince Albert, represented this ideal vision of marital virtue and familial devotion. To the Victorians, marriage was civilization's most sacred art, two souls bound by duty, performing together the eternal dance of restraint and respect. And though their world often stifled love in the name of morality, their faith in the sanctity of marriage endured as both burden and blessing, a reminder that, in their eyes, order was beauty and duty was love's truest form. In the grand hierarchy of Victorian values, the education of women stood at a delicate crossroads between enlightenment and control. While the 19th century witnessed a growing fascination with progress, intellect, and reform. Society remained uneasy about the idea of an educated woman who might think too freely or live too independently. Education for women was encouraged only within the narrow boundaries of moral improvement. To learn was acceptable, so long as it made her a better wife, mother, or hostess. To think too deeply, however, was dangerous. A woman's mind, Victorians believed, was a garden that must be carefully tended, not left wild with ideas that might challenge the order of things. And so, young girls were taught lessons of refinement rather than intellect, music, drawing, needlework, and polite conversation. Arithmetic was acceptable for household management. Geography only for travel etiquette. History, literature, and the Bible were presented not as gateways to independent thought, but as instruments of moral instruction. The purpose was not to awaken the mind, but to polish the soul. Schools for girls were often extensions of this philosophy. They resembled finishing schools more than academic institutions, places where posture, elocution, and embroidery were given as much importance as reading and writing. The perfect student was not the one who questioned, but the one who obeyed. She was trained to walk gracefully, to curtsy, to write letters in elegant hand, and to speak without asserting. In wealthier families, governesses were employed to ensure that girls absorbed the right kind of education, one that refined their manners while limiting their imagination. Even literature, that great liberator of the mind, was filtered through moral censorship. Novels that depicted passion, rebellion, or female independence were frowned upon as corrupting influences. Instead, women were encouraged to read sentimental works that reinforced virtue, patience, and submission. Knowledge that did not serve domestic life was considered both unnecessary and unfeminine. Too much learning, it was said, might make a woman proud, argumentative, or worst of all, unmarriageable. Yet, beneath this culture of restriction, a quiet revolution stirred. As the century progressed, voices like Mary Wollstonecraft, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and later, John Stuart Mill began to challenge the intellectual imprisonment of women. The rise of female academies and the first women's colleges in the mid to late Victorian period began to chip away at centuries of prejudice. Still, progress was painfully slow. Women who pursued higher education were often mocked as bluestockings, accused of losing their femininity in pursuit of intellect. Many men feared that education would make women rebellious, questioning their husband's authority or neglecting their household duties. But those who did break through, governesses who wrote novels, reformers who founded schools, or mothers who taught their daughters more than sewing, planted the seeds of a quiet but lasting transformation. They began to redefine what it meant to be virtuous, not submission to ignorance, but the courage to think while remaining graceful. For them, intellect was not rebellion, but refinement of a higher kind. The paradox of Victorian womanhood thus reached its height in the realm of education. Women were expected to be intelligent enough to guide children, but not so learned as to lead men, wise enough to manage a home, but not bold enough to challenge society. Education became both their crown and their cajan ornament to display, not a tool to wield. And yet, even within those limits, countless women found ways to nurture their minds, reading in secret, teaching one another, and preserving the spark of curiosity that society feared. In their quiet persistence, they redefined the meaning of intellect and virtue alike, showing that true education could never be confined by etiquette or beneath the polished surface of Victorian politeness, beneath the rigid codes of gender and propriety, there simmered a quiet rebellion not of swords or speeches, but of hearts and minds bound by decorum. The 19th century prided itself on moral order, yet that order was built upon the careful suppression of half its population's desires and voices. Gender roles in Victorian society were painted with moral certainty, men as the guardians of intellect and authority, women as the keepers of virtue and emotion. The separation of spheres was absolute. The public world belonged to men, the private to women. He labored in factories, offices, and parliament. She reigned over nursery and kitchen, her domain limited to the moral and the maternal. Yet in this very confinement, women began to develop an inner strength, a subtle awareness that gentleness itself could be a form of resistance. They learned to maneuver within the narrow corridors of expectation, bending without breaking, influencing without appearing to rule. Power, in the Victorian sense, was always dressed in manners. For men, it meant leadership and logic. For women, persuasion and patience. But behind every respectable household, behind every gentleman's reputation, stood a woman who shaped decisions in whispers and gestures. She wielded influence, not through command, but through the art of suggestion, mastering what historians would later call the politics of the drawing room. A raised eyebrow, a softened tone, a well-timed silence, these were her weapons in a world that denied her voice. Yet her rebellion was not merely domestic. Through letters, literature, and quiet charity, women began to challenge the very ideas that confined them. Poets like Elizabeth Barrett Browning wrote verses that redefined feminine strength, while novelists like Charlotte Brontë and George Eliot created heroines who refused to be silenced. Their words, often masked by the language of virtue, carried the pulse of defiance. Each novel, each poem, each diary entry became a small act of protest against a society that demanded composure at all costs. Men, too, were prisoners of their own image. The ideal of the stoic gentleman, strong, emotionless, endlessly composed, often left them isolated, unable to express tenderness without fear of ridicule. Many suffered in silence, bound by the same expectations that glorified self-control and punished vulnerability. The Victorian obsession with propriety thus chained both genders, turning emotion into weakness and conformity into survival. But as the century advanced, cracks began to appear. The women's suffrage movement, the rise of reformers, and the gradual recognition of female intellect all signaled a shifting tide. The silent rebellion of drawing rooms grew into public campaigns, essays, and petitions. Yet, even as voices rose, the most powerful defiance remained the quietest, the simple act of thinking freely in a world that forbade it. The Victorian woman's rebellion was written not in fire, but in ink, not shouted, but whispered through pages, glances, and unspoken dreams. In the end, this delicate rebellion did not destroy the Victorian world, it transformed it from within. It proved that strength need not be loud, that endurance can be as radical as revolution. Gender, once the rigid architecture of society, became its most fragile foundation. The very ideals of gentility and virtue that once confined women became the instruments of their liberation. By mastering the language of restraint, they learned to speak in silence. By playing their roles perfectly, they revealed the flaws in the play itself. Thus, the story of gender in the Victorian age is not merely one of oppression, but of resilience, a slow awakening beneath layers of lace and etiquette. The rebellion may have been silent, but its echoes shaped the modern soul. Asterisk. In the grand social theater of Victorian England, class was not merely an economic distinction, it was a language, a subtle and elaborate code, spoken through tone, gesture, dress, and manners. It governed how one spoke, dined, walked, and even breathed. To the Victorians, class was destiny written in deportment. The aristocrat, the middle-class merchant, and the working poor all moved through separate worlds, connected only by the unyielding hierarchy that defined them. Yet, as the Industrial Revolution blurred old boundaries and created new wealth, society grew obsessed with decoding the signals of refinement that could distinguish the truly genteel from mere pretenders. Politeness became a kind of currency, a performance of breeding and morality that allowed individuals to navigate the treacherous waters of social mobility, to speak properly, to bow correctly, to know which fork to use and when to remove one's gloves. These were not trivial details, but marks of civilization itself. Every conversation was a test, every encounter a chance to affirm one's place within the invisible order of respectability for the upper classes. Refinement was inherited like an heirloom. Their accent, posture, and confidence carried the weight of generations. They did not need to prove gentility. Their politeness was effortless, almost bored in its perfection. They viewed manners as proof of moral superiority, an unspoken assurance that they were the natural rulers of society. The middle class, however, lived in a constant state of performance. Their new money had bought comfort, but not pedigree, and so they studied the rituals of refinement with near religious devotion. Conduct manuals, etiquette guides, and fashion journals became their scriptures. In drawing rooms and dinner parties, they rehearsed the delicate choreography of polite conversation, ever too bold, never too reserved, always proper. To be mistaken for vulgar was a kind of social death. Respectability was their shield, and every detail of behavior, from the cut of a coat to the arrangement of a calling card, served as armor against embarrassment. Even servants were expected to maintain decorum. Their politeness reflected the reputation of their employers. For the working class, politeness existed in a different form, less ornamental, more moral. They were taught to respect authority, to speak humbly, to be clean and sober. The Victorian idea of improvement demanded that even the poor aspire to refinement. For good manners were seen as the bridge between classes, a sign of moral worth rather than wealth. Yet, this belief was double-edged. Politeness promised dignity, but it also reinforced obedience. The polite worker was admirable, the assertive one dangerous. In this way, class politeness functioned as both virtue and control, teaching every man and woman to know their place while pretending that civility made them equal. Language itself became a battleground of class identity. The accent of one's speech could reveal origins more quickly than any title, and to speak properly was to distance oneself from the vulgarity of the streets. Newspapers and novels of the time mocked those who aspired to, obviously, labeling them social climbers or upstarts. Yet, It was this very imitation, the desire to belong, that sustained the culture of refinement. Thus, the Victorian world became a masterpiece of manners, where civility masked tension and every polite smile hid silent judgment. Class was not simply lived, was performed, a constant act of self-control and observation. And though the system promised stability, it bred, for even the gentlest slip, a misplaced word, an awkward gesture could betray the truth of one's origins. To survive, one had to master the language of class so completely that it became second nature. In this world, politeness was not kindness but art, not honesty but survival. And so, behind every gracious bow and well-bred compliment, the Victorians performed their most intricate illusion that civility was equality, when in truth it was the finest disguise of power ever worn. No class in Victorian England clung more fiercely to manners than the middle class. For to them, politeness was not only virtue, it was validation. The aristocracy had birth, the working poor had labor, but the middle class had only respectability to define themselves. And so, they built their lives upon the fragile foundation of appearances. Their drawing rooms, neatly arranged, with floral wallpaper, mahogany furniture, and embroidered cushions, became temples of refinement, where even the positioning of a teacup was a declaration of dignity. For the self-made man and his carefully composed wife, manners were the passport to acceptance in a world that still looked down upon trade and toil. To host a dinner party with grace, to exchange visiting cards with the proper flourish, to dress in the newest but not the gaudest fashion, these were acts of survival disguised as civility. Every interaction carried a whisper of anxiety. Am I refined enough? Do I belong? Thus, the middle-class obsession with etiquette became both aspiration and affliction, a constant performance in the theater of gentility. In this world, behavior was currency and humility its highest denomination. The Victorian middle class defined themselves not by wealth alone, but by the moral weight of their decorum. They were the apostles of self-improvement, believing that through discipline, temperance, and politeness, even the humblest man could ascend the ladder of society. Conduct manuals, like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management and the Habits of Good Society, served as their sacred texts, teaching everything from the proper way to hold a fork to the ideal tone for expressing condolences. The middle-class woman, in particular, bore the heaviest burden of this new morality. Her manners were her husband's reputation, her grace his status. She was expected to embody serenity, modesty, and punctuality at all times. Her home had to radiate order, her children obedience, and her presence gentle authority. Even her leisure was moralized. Needlework, piano, or charitable visits replaced frivolous pursuits. In her parlor, conversation was delicate, laughter restrained, and every word weighed against the invisible measure of propriety. Yet beneath this glittering surface of gentility, the middle-class world trembled with insecurity. For every act of refinement was also an act of concealment, of origins, of emotions, of doubt. Many of those who dined off polished silver had once labored in factories or shops, and the memory of struggle lingered behind the lace curtains. Their pursuit of manners often bordered on mimicry, as they borrowed the customs of the upper class without the ease of inheritance. To the aristocrat, this imitation was amusing. To the working class, it was pretension. And so, the The middle class existed in a kind of social purgatory, respected for their industry, ridiculed for their earnestness. Politeness, meant to unite society, instead deepened its divisions. But there was also something noble in their effort. In their relentless pursuit of refinement, they transformed manners into a moral mission, linking civility with progress and self-respect. To be polite was to prove one's humanity in an age of machines and factories. The mirage of middle-class manners, then, was not simply hypocrisy, was hope. It represented the dream that character could transcend birth, that order and grace could redeem chaos. Through their rituals of propriety, they sought to humanize modern life, to bring dignity to ambition and virtue to success. Even if their gentility was partly illusion, it was a beautiful wana mirror reflecting their belief in improvement and aspiration. For the Victorians, especially those between wealth and want, manners were not just social tools. They were a moral language, a declaration of faith that civility could elevate even the most ordinary soul. And though history has since unmasked the pretensions of their world, their devotion to decency remains one of its most enduring legacies, a fragile, shining mirage in the dusty corridors of class. Among the grand estates and candlelit ballrooms of Victorian England, the aristocracy lived within a world so polished, so ceremoniously refined, that every glance, gesture, and word carried the weight of centuries. Courtesy, for them, was not learned, was inherited, woven into the fabric of their lineage, like a family crest. To be born into nobility was to be born into performance. A life governed by rules of civility, so delicate and complex that they seemed almost sacred. The aristocratic code of courtesy was not merely a social tool, but a philosophy, a belief that elegance was proof of moral and natural superiority. In their gilded world, manners were a language of authority, a means of maintaining distance while appearing gracious. A true nobleman did not raise his voice. He ruled through calmness, through the invisible power of poise. A lady of rank never flaunted her wealth. Her refinement was measured not by excess, but by effortlessness. Their world demanded grace that appeared innate, as if politeness itself were a sign of divine favor. The etiquette of the aristocracy was both art and armor. It concealed arrogance beneath charm and privilege beneath humility. The perfect bow, the subtle smile, the measured compliment, all were part of a ritual of control. Every dinner, every dance, every conversation was a miniature performance of order, an unspoken declaration that civility separated the noble from the common. The tone of one's voice, the pace of one's speech, even the choice of words reflected education and breeding. Vulgarity, the aristocrat would say, was not a matter of poverty, but of behavior. To speak too loudly, to laugh too freely, to show too much emotion, these were breaches far worse than ignorance. True refinement lay in restraint, in the ability to make others feel at ease while never lowering oneself. Even acts of charity were bound by etiquette. The nobleman might feed the poor, but he did so with detached dignity, his generosity wrapped in the silk of obligation. The lady might host a charity bazaar, but her kindness was ritualized, an extension of grace rather than compassion. And yet, beneath this serene facade, the aristocratic world trembled with its own anxieties. Industrial wealth was rising fast, threatening to outshine old money. merchants and manufacturers, armed with fortunes but no pedigrees, sought entry into high society, imitating its manners with feverish precision. To the aristocrat, this imitation was both flattering and infuriating. Politeness became a battleground where authenticity was tested and pretenders exposed. Thus, the code of courtesy grew even stricter. A misplaced word, an accent too provincial, a handshake to firm these were enough to betray an impostor. But the irony was cruel. The more the upper class tried to preserve its distinction through civility, the more that civility became something anyone could learn. The very rules meant to maintain exclusivity began to democratize gentility itself. Still, the aristocracy clung to its rituals with almost religious devotion. The grand dinner parties, the carriage rides through Hyde Park, the measured exchanges in parlors and ballrooms, all were performances in the theater of grace. Even love followed formality. Courtship unfolded through coded glances, brief conversations, and letters scented with restraint. Passion was permissible only when tamed by propriety. In this rarefied world, the smallest gesture carried symbolic weight. To rise when a lady entered the room, to never turn one's back on a superior, to thank the servant without familiarity act reaffirmed a system older than empire itself. The aristocratic code of courtesy thus became the final fortress of an age that feared change. It was beauty carved from hierarchy, politeness turned into power, and grace elevated into law. And though its glitter eventually faded beneath the smoke of progress, the echo of its manners still lingers wherever refinement is mistaken for virtue. In the grand households of Victorian England, where chandeliers glowed and silverware gleamed, the invisible machinery that sustained the elegance of the upper and middle classes was the army of servants who lived in silence beneath the stairs. They were the shadow of respectability, the quiet hands that polished the illusion of gentility. Every aristocratic dinner, every immaculate parlor, every well-bred conversation depended on their unseen labor. Yet within that world of refinement, a complex hierarchy existed, a world within a world, bound by its own rules of deference and discipline. Servants were expected to be invisible, yet omnipresent, humble, yet perfect in execution. A butler's calm was the symbol of household dignity. A maid's silence was a measure of her virtue. To serve was not simply to work, it was to play a part in the grand drama of class, where obedience was both performance and survival. The Victorian household thus became a living portrait of the era's obsession with order, where even kindness had rank and every gesture was an echo of authority. Service in those days was an art of self-erasure. A good servant was not seen but sensed, anticipated the master's needs before they were voiced, and moved with the grace of ritual. There were rules for everything. The butler stood nearest the door, the footman behind him, the housemaid kept to the edges of rooms, never turning her back on her mistress. Every word had to be measured, every glance lowered. The tone of voice was part of the etiquette of submission, for even politeness had a hierarchy. The mistress of the house might address her maid with a softened authority, Jane, while Jane replied only with a curtsy and the word, "Yes, ma'am." This ritualized deference was not merely habit. It preserved the illusion that society's order was natural, that those who served did so gladly. Servants, after all, were expected to mirror the virtues their masters claimed to embody: loyalty, humility, and grace. Yet beneath this polished obedience, resentment and pride often brewed. The servant knew the secrets of the household, the quarrels, the debts, the pretenses, and in that knowledge lay a quiet power for the upper classes. The behavior of their servants reflected their own worth. A well-trained staff was proof of refinement. Disorder below stairs hinted at moral failure above. Thus, masters demanded not only labor but dignity from those they employed, enforcing manners as strictly in the servants' hall as in the dining room. Etiquette manuals of the era even advised employers on how to manage politeness, insisting that familiarity would erode respect. Yet, paradoxically, many Victorian servants developed a sense of fierce loyalty to their households, treating their duties as a sacred trust. To serve well was to possess a certain moral superiority over the idle poor. Service offered stability, food, and a strange kind of pride in perfection. A butler who had spent decades in one home was not a mere employee, he was an institution. His polished shoes, his quiet dignity, his memory of every guest and occasion made him part of the family's living history. But the relationship between master and servant was never simple. It was built on affection and resentment, dependence and disdain. Some mistresses treated their maids with maternal kindness. Others ruled with cold precision. Gossip, betrayal, and small rebellions were common below stairs. An extra sip of wine, a letter read in secret, a whispered complaint after lights out. The rise of the servant novel and the moral panic over impertinence revealed the class anxiety that simmered beneath domestic harmony. By the late century, as factories and new professions offered independence, many servants began leaving service, and the rigid hierarchies of the household began to crack. The age of deference, so long sustained by ritualized politeness, was fading. Yet its echoes remain in the modern imagination: the crisp uniforms, the careful bows, the language of sir and madam in the grand theater of Victorian manners. Servants were both audience and actors, performing civility that was never their own, yet shaping, through their quiet endurance, the very elegance that defined an age. In Victorian England, respectability was the grand performance upon which the entire social stage was built. A play where everyone knew their lines and no one dared break character. To be respectable was to exist under constant observation by neighbors, by society, and by one's own conscience. Every street, every drawing room, every Sunday pew was a miniature theater in which reputation was both costume and currency. The respectable man rose early, worked diligently, avoided scandal, and spoke in measured tones. The respectable woman managed her household with grace, kept her emotions discreet, and embodied the moral light of domestic virtue. Together they represented the Victorian dream, a world governed by self-control, decency, and visible order. Yet beneath the starched collars and polished manners lay the anxiety of exposure. One misstep, one rumor, one whispered doubt could undo years of careful performance. Respectability was less a state of being than a state of vigilance, an endless rehearsal in the art of appearing good. This obsession with propriety reached every corner of society. The middle class, in particular, clung to it as the hallmark of moral worth, using it to distinguish themselves from both the idle aristocracy and the unruly working poor. Conduct books, sermons, and social clubs reinforced the idea that virtue must be demonstrated as visibly as wealth. Cleanliness, punctuality, moderation, and humility, these were not merely moral traits, but social obligations. A respectable man might not be rich, but he must appear disciplined. A woman might not be beautiful, but she must appear modest. Respectability thus blurred the line between morality and performance until they became indistinguishable. Even acts of charity, one's spontaneous gestures of compassion, became carefully staged spectacles of virtue tea parties for orphans, bazaars for widows, and sermons for the salvation of the poor. The goal was not merely to help, but to be seen helping. Respectability turned private goodness into public theater. The cost of this performance was emotional suffocation. The demand for composure forbade vulnerability. Passion became indecency, and sorrow weakness. Men hid their fears behind stoic facades, while women buried their frustrations beneath smiles of obedience. The ideal family portrait: father at the hearth, mother with her embroidery, children at play, was less reality than propaganda, a tableau of harmony that masked the silences between them. For every moral victory, there was a hidden compromise. For every polished exterior, a trembling heart. The pressure to conform was relentless. Gossip was the unspoken police of the era, spreading faster than ink, destroying reputations overnight. To be labeled improper was social death. And so the Victorians became masters of concealment of desire, of dissent, of despair. Hypocrisy, born from fear, became a social virtue. Even those who despised the charade dared not abandon it, for respectability was the only bridge between acceptance and ruin. And yet, this very theater of manners sustained the illusion of order that allowed Victorian society to thrive. The performance of virtue, even when insincere, created a code of conduct that curbed chaos and lent stability to a rapidly changing world. Industry, empire, and faith all drew legitimacy from the appearance of moral certainty. The respectable citizen became the cornerstone of the empire's self-image, disciplined, benevolent, and superior. But history would later reveal that this mask of virtue hid the contradictions of an age that preached morality while profiting from inequality. Still, there was beauty in their struggle, the yearning for decency, the attempt to live gracefully amid hypocrisy. The theater of respectability, for all its illusions, was also a testament to human hope that through order, perhaps goodness could be learned, and through manners, the chaos of life might momentarily appear divine. Though the gas lamps of Victorian London have long gone dark and the rustle of silk gowns has faded into memory, the echoes of Victorian politeness still shape the rhythm of our modern world. We no longer bow or curtsy, nor send calling cards with gilt edges, but the spirit of courtesy that once ruled drawing rooms and parlors has merely changed costume. Today, it lives in emails that open with "Dear Sir" or "Madam," in the quiet "Excuse me" on crowded trains, in dinner parties where we still debate which fork to use. The Victorian code of manners, once an iron law of social survival, has softened into habit, a ghost of grace lingering in the machinery of modern life. Yet beneath this transformation lies the same yearning that once defined the 19th century, the desire to belong, to appear decent, to measure worth through behavior. Our age prides itself on freedom, but it still clings to the rituals of respectability, merely disguised in the language of professionalism and civility. The modern workplace, with its hierarchies and polite formalities, echoes the drawing rooms of old. The internet, with its performative politeness and cancel culture, mirrors the moral surveillance of the Victorian street. We may mock their prudery, but we live beneath our own invisible codes, equally watchful and unforgiving in the 21st century. Politeness continues to be both armor and art. Where Victorians once used manners to navigate class, we now use them to manage identity in a global world. Politeness remains a form of power, subtle, adaptable, and deeply human. It can soothe conflict, conceal truth, or create belonging, just as it did in the age of Queen Victoria. The modern professional, choosing words carefully in an email, performs a ritual as old as the gentleman removing his hat to a lady. The vocabulary has changed, but the instinct remains to appear competent, calm, and controlled. Social media, that great public stage, has revived the theater of manners in digital form. The curated politeness of posts and comments, the unspoken rules of tone and imagery, echo the Victorian obsession with appearance and moral order. Like them, we are actors before an unseen audience, polishing our image for approval. Respectability has become virtual, but its weight is no less real. Every tweet is a calling card. Every like is a nod in the modern salon of public opinion. Yet even now, the contradictions persist. Just as Victorians used civility to mask inequality, modern politeness often conceals discomfort and hypocrisy. In corporate meetings, with all due respect often means the opposite. In politics, manners can become manipulation. The polite smile can still hide indifference. The courteous word can still silence dissent. But to dismiss politeness as mere pretense would be unfair. The Victorians, for all their restraint, understood something. We are in danger of forgetting that manners, when sincere, are not chains, but bridges. They allow strangers to coexist, soften the friction of difference, and transform self-interest into respect. In an age of noise and haste, their belief in composure carries unexpected wisdom. Perhaps our hurried emails and anxious interactions reveal not how different we are from them, but how much we still crave the order their world promised. The legacy of Victorian politeness, then, is not a museum piece, but a living current that flows quietly through our speech, our gestures, our sense of decency. It reminds us that civilization, at its core, is a conversation, a delicate balance between truth and tact, self and society. Though the corsets are gone and the carriages replaced by screens, the old etiquette endures in every pause before we speak, in every effort to be kind while being right. The Victorians taught the world that politeness, however flawed, is humanity's most elegant defense against chaos. And in our restless century, that lesson still whispers softly, like the faint rustle of silk in a digital wind. If the Victorians had lived to see the 21st century, they might have recognized the digital world not as a revolution, but as a reincarnation of their own, a vast new ballroom of appearances, filled with rituals of decorum, surveillance, and self-presentation. The polite bow has become the emoji, the calling card, a profile picture. Introductions now begin not in drawing rooms, but in chat boxes and comment sections. And yet, the purpose remains unchanged: to create impression, to command respect, and to maintain the fragile harmony between strangers. The digital age, despite its noise and speed, is a society obsessed with etiquette, though its rules are unwritten, evolving with every click. Where the Victorians carried conduct manuals, we scrolled through social platforms, intuiting the same ancient dance of restraint and display. To like without seeming desperate, to disagree without appearing cruel, to post without oversharing. These are the modern manners, delicate as lace and just as easily torn. Our devices have become the new mirrors of morality, reflecting not who we are, but who we hope to appear. Just as the Victorians feared social disgrace, we fear digital shaming. Online reputation is as fragile as ever. A single post can define or destroy. A careless comment can brand one forever. The modern scandal, born from screenshots and trending hashtags, mirrors the gossip networks of Victorian London, where whispers traveled faster than truth. The old parlour has become a global stage, and the audience never sleeps. In this endless performance, politeness serves as both defense and disguise. We curate our speech, filter our images, and practice the digital equivalent of the well-timed smile. Social media etiquette: thanking followers, apologizing publicly, avoiding taboo topics functions as our new moral compass. Even the phrase "be kind online" echoes the Victorian ideal of moral restraint. The technology has changed, but the fear of social judgment remains identical. We perform courtesy, not because it is easy, but because without it, the world feels unbearable. Yet, in this reinvention, politeness has also become strangely hollow. The instant, impersonal nature of communication has turned etiquette into performance rather than connection. We react instead of listening, comment instead of conversing. The warmth of a handwritten note has been replaced by a string of emojis. Sincerity often dissolves in the digital glare. The Victorians may have been accused of hypocrisy, but their manners were tangible, embodied in tone and presence. Our age, for all its freedom, often lacks that subtle grace. Still, there is beauty in the effort. The fact that people continue to seek civility in spaces designed for speed and anonymity reveals how deeply the need for order and empathy is rooted in human nature. Each polite interaction online, however small, becomes an act of resistance against chaos. Every please and thank you typed into the void is an echo of a centuries-old belief that civilization depends not on technology, but on tone. The reinvention of manners in the digital age is thus both triumph and tragedy. We have democratized communication, allowing every voice to be heard, but we have also amplified misunderstanding. We have globalized politeness, yet weakened its sincerity. Still, just as the Victorians used etiquette to humanize the industrial age, we now use it to humanize the technological one. Our hashtags are our handshakes, our digital profiles, our parlors. The screen may have replaced the salon, but the need for grace remains unchanged. Perhaps, in learning to be polite in this virtual wilderness, we are once again relearning what the Victorians knew too well, that manners, however imperfect, are the only language that can make strangers feel human. For much of the 20th century, the world sought to escape the stiff corset of Victorian formality. The wars, revolutions, and countercultures that followed tore down the old hierarchies, replacing ceremony with authenticity, restraint with freedom. The bowler hat gave way to bare heads, the handwritten letter to the quick phone call, the yours faithfully to the simple best. To be formal came to mean to be false, and informality became the language of sincerity. In offices, homes, and schools, titles dissolved, teachers became friends. Bosses, mentors, and the old codes of respect were traded for equality. The decline of formality seemed a liberation, a breaking of chains that had long confined the human spirit. But as the 20th century waned and the digital one dawned, something curious happened. The world began to feel its absence. The very freedom that had once felt exhilarating began to seem unmoored, stripped of grace. Informality had blurred the lines between closeness and chaos, leaving people uncertain how to balance honesty with respect. And so, quietly, almost imperceptibly, the old manners began to return, not as obligation, but as choice, not as performance, but as art. The revival of formality in the modern age is not a return to the rigid codes of the past, but a reimagining of their purpose. In an era of immediacy, formality offers intention. In a culture of noise, it offers pause. Where once politeness was armor, it is now sanctuary. People rediscover the comfort of rituals, the handwritten thank you note, the formal greeting, the dress code at a wedding, not out of vanity, but out of longing for meaning. In the workplace, professional etiquette has returned, dressed in new language, emotional intelligence, communication ethics, mutual respect. Even online, the trend toward digital decorum shows the same impulse to restore dignity to dialogue. We now teach our children to speak kindly, wait their turn, listen before replying, phrases that echo directly from the parlors of the past. The form may have changed, but the function remains. Formality protects the fragile fabric of human interaction from tearing under the strain of ego and haste. And yet, this revival carries contradictions. The modern revivalist of manners must navigate a world allergic to pretension, where too much polish can appear insincere. Formality today must be warm, not cold, inclusive, not exclusive. The modern gentleman must listen as well as lead. The modern lady must speak as well as smile. In this sense, the revival of etiquette marks progress rather than regression. It is a refinement of equality rather than hierarchy. We no longer use manners to divide, but to connect, not to hide emotion, but to express it gracefully. In a sense, we have taken the skeleton of Victorian formality and filled it with a new soul, one that values empathy over perfection. The return of formality, then, is not nostalgia, but necessity. It is our quiet rebellion against the rudeness of the digital age, our attempt to preserve humanity in a time when everything feels mechanical. Perhaps this is the greatest irony of history, that what the Victorians built out of fear, we now rebuild out of yearning. Their formality was a shield against scandal. Ours is a bridge toward sincerity. We no longer need etiquette to prove our virtue, but we still need it to preserve our civility. The decline of formality taught us freedom, but its revival teaches us grace. And so, even in our most modern moments, when we rise to shake a hand, when we say thank you instead of clicking like, when we listen before replying, we echo the ghosts of a more courteous time. The Victorians may have left their parlors behind, but their manners, softened by time, still light the path to what it means to be human. In the days of Queen Victoria, to be called a gentleman was not simply to belong to a class, it was to embody a code. The word carried a moral gravity that reached far beyond wealth or wardrobe. It was a title of character. A gentleman was expected to be honest, self-controlled, charitable, and discreet. His handshake was his oath, his word a bond stronger than parchment. Yet, like much of Victorian life, this morality was both genuine and performative, a mirror polished to perfection but hiding cracks beneath. The Victorian gentleman learned early to conceal passion behind composure, to practice restraint as virtue, and to carry himself with the quiet dignity that signaled superiority without arrogance. His morality was visible worn as neatly as his waistcoat. His image, like the empire he served, had to project stability, discipline, and decency. But as the centuries turned and the empire dissolved, so too did the old script. Factories replaced estates, cities replaced manners, and gentility became less about lineage and more about behavior. The modern world, fast and unfiltered, demanded a new kind of gentleman, one whose strength lay not in control, but in conscience. Today, the modern gentleman walks through a world far louder and freer than his ancestors could imagine. Yet he still feels their shadows behind him. He may no longer wear a top hat or quote Latin at dinner, but the moral expectation remains to be respectful, kind, and composed amid chaos. The essence of the Victorian ideal lingers in his gestures, in holding the door, in apologizing sincerely, in choosing words with care. Where once etiquette demanded silence from emotion, now it demands empathy. True gentility has evolved from performance to awareness, from the art of appearances to the art of understanding. The modern gentleman is not defined by wealth, but by his ability to respect others without condescension, to lead without domination, to disagree without contempt. His morality is not about hiding flaws, but about acknowledging them gracefully, in a sense. He carries the same moral compass the Victorians prized: honor, integrity, restraint, but he uses it to navigate a world where manners are measured not by elegance, but by emotional intelligence. Yet this transformation did not come without struggle. The 20th century, with its wars and upheavals, dismantled the old structures of chivalry, often reducing them to nostalgia or parody. The very word gentleman began to sound quaint, even hypocritically relic of privilege. But as the 21st century unfolded, society began to rediscover its value. Amid the noise of aggression and the cult of self-promotion, the quiet virtues of humility, respect, and reliability regained their luster. The modern man, overwhelmed by choice and speed, began to seek meaning in decency. Corporate ethics replaced aristocratic honor. Social responsibility replaced noblesse oblige. The moral framework once reserved for the elite became the measure of every individual, striving for dignity in a disordered world. Even in the digital realm, the idea of the gentleman has found new expression: the person who debates without insult, who credits others' work, who refuses cruelty disguised as humor. Thus, the modern gentleman is not a ghost of the past, but a survivor of it, reshaped by necessity. He does not hide behind etiquette. He uses it to connect. He does not act polite because society demands it, but because empathy commands it. His image is no longer defined by posture or pedigree, but by presence, the ability to remain calm, kind, and consistent when the world around him trembles. He is proof that morality, once confined to drawing rooms and duels, can live comfortably in offices and online forums. The Victorians built the mold. We have filled it with humanity, and perhaps that is the ultimate evolution, that the true gentleman in any century is not the man who never errs, but the one who never forgets to be gentle. Long after the carriages vanished from cobblestone streets and the gas lamps flickered out, the ghost of Victorian etiquette still lingers in the modern conscience, faint yet unmistakable, like the trace of perfume on an old letter. It endures because it was never merely about manners. It was about meaning. The Victorians understood, perhaps better than any age before or since, that civility was not a luxury, but a necessity, a fragile architecture built to keep chaos at bay. Every rule of conversation, every ritual of courtesy was a small attempt to civilize instinct, to turn impulse into grace. And though their world was flawed, their aspiration endures. We still pause before interrupting, still send condolences in sorrow, still stand when elders enter a room. Beneath the surface of our modern haste, the rhythm of their restraint continues to beat softly. Etiquette, stripped of its pretensions, remains a language of Quran, acknowledgement of the other. The Victorians may have wrapped it in formality and fear of judgment, but at its heart was a profound moral insight that respect, once lost, unravels society itself. In the 21st century, their legacy survives not in corsets or calling cards, but in the invisible habits that bind strangers together. When a commuter offers a seat, when a teacher writes a note of encouragement, when a worker apologizes for a delay, these are echoes of Victorian decency, reframed by empathy. We no longer bow to class, but we still bow to kindness. The stage has changed, but the play remains the same. Etiquette, far from being an obsolete relic, has adapted to every medium humanity has created. It lives in corporate ethics, in human rights discourse, in online codes of conduct. It shapes the diplomacy that prevents wars and the simple thank you that prevents resentment. The Victorians gave these gestures form. We have given them freedom. Their etiquette was written in books of conduct. Ours is written in the silent expectations of coexistence. Yet the principle remains identical, that civilization depends on restraint, that compassion requires discipline, and that dignity is not self-invented but shared. But this endurance is not without irony. The same world that inherited their manners also mocks them. We call them prudish, repressed, hypocritical, and indeed, their morality often masked cruelty, their politeness concealed prejudice. Yet, if we strip away the hypocrisy and keep the hope, we find something precious beneath the belief that people could learn to be better through behavior. That is what gives Victorian etiquette its strange modern relevance. It was an attempt, however imperfect, to teach humanity how to coexist with itself. In a time of instant opinions and endless noise, that aspiration feels radical. The Victorians used manners to hide. We can use them to heal. Where they sought to appear good, we can seek to be good. Their etiquette, once a cage, can now become a crafty, mindful art of living gracefully in a graceless age. in the end. What survives from the Victorian Code is not the stiffness of its rules, but the softness of its purpose. To live with respect, to speak with care, to see the world not as a mirror, but as a room shared with others. These are the principles that will always outlast the fashions of time. The carriages have rusted, the parlors are gone, but the essence of civility endures quietly, stubbornly, beautifully. For all our modern progress, we still return again and again to the same truth the Victorians once knew, that manners are not about superiority, but about sympathy, not about class, but about kindness. And as long as that belief lives, the etiquette of the Victorian era will never truly die. It will simply change its attire and continue its eternal dance through every age that calls itself civilized.